The rain hit sideways under the broken orange streetlight when Daniel Cole pulled over for the stranded sedan. 10 hours earlier, the same company that owned this stretch of road had handed him a termination letter. The moment she rolled down the window, mascara smeared, voice shaking, he recognized her instantly. Catherine Whitfield, the CEO who had fired him that morning, stranded alone with a dead battery in the middle of nowhere. He did not hesitate. The job was the job. This was just a person who needed help. He popped his trunk, pulled out a set of jumper cables, and said nothing about the letter folded in his glove compartment. She had no idea who he was. Stick around. The moment she finally figures out who he is changes everything that comes after it. The morning had started like any other morning for 6 years running. Daniel Cole arrived at the Whitfield Industries warehouse at 6:45. Badge clipped to his belt, coffee in a scratched travel mug, boots still damp from the walk across the lot. He clocked in, checked the overnight shipment logs, and was halfway through a forklift inspection when a message came down asking him to report to the executive floor. Nobody on the floor ever got called up there for good news, and every man near him knew it, though none of them said so out loud. By 8 o'clock, he was standing in front of a wide glass desk on the top floor, watching a termination letter slide across polished wood toward him. Catherine Whitfield read from a page someone else had prepared, her voice even, careful, rehearsed in the way people rehearse things they do not want to say. Her eyes lifted only twice during the entire exchange. Near the window, arms folded, stood Richard Voss, watching Daniel with the flat expression of a man observing something he had already decided to discard. Daniel picked up the letter, folded it once along its crease, and slid it into his jacket pocket without a word. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask why, because some part of him already understood that whatever reason they gave him would not be the true one. He asked only a single question. Would his benefits carry through the end of the month for his daughter's sake? Catherine's pen paused mid-air, and something crossed her face that looked, for half a second, like doubt. Then Voss cleared his throat from the window, and she wrote a short note on the folder without answering him directly. Daniel walked out through the same hallway he had walked 1,000 times before, past men he had trained himself, past the loading bay where his name still hung on a supervisor's schedule taped crookedly to a corkboard. Nobody said anything as he passed. Nobody held his gaze for more than a second. That was how it went when a company wanted a layoff to look clean, quiet, and easily forgotten by everyone left behind. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for a long while before starting the engine, staring at the warehouse sign through the windshield, thinking about how he would explain any of this to a 9-year-old who still believed her father could fix anything. He thought about the mortgage payment due in 9 days, the truck registration renewal sitting unopened on the counter at home, the quiet math that ran through his head every time money got tight since his wife passed. None of it showed on his face. He had gotten good at that over the years, keeping the worry somewhere Lily could never see it. Inside the warehouse, word traveled fast the way it always did. A younger loader named Marcus caught up to him near the gate before he left, asking quietly if the rumors were true. Daniel only nodded once, shook the younger man's hand, and told him to keep his head down and do good work regardless of who signed his paycheck. It was the kind of advice a man gives when he still believes it, even on the day it costs him the most. He picked up Lily from school that afternoon like he always did, right on time, lunchbox rattling against her backpack, her voice running in 20 directions at once about a science project involving baking soda, vinegar, and a plastic volcano she had painted the night before with too much red. He listened to every word of it, nodding at the right moments, laughing when she wanted him to laugh. He did not mention the cardboard box sitting behind the driver's seat, holding a stapler, a coffee mug that read "World's Okayest Dad," and a small framed photograph of her mother that had once sat on his desk. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep with a half-finished book open on her chest, Voss called Catherine at home. His voice came through easy, almost pleased with itself, telling her the warehouse restructuring had gone through without complications, that the quarterly numbers would look considerably better once the changes settled in. Catherine sat on the edge of her kitchen counter, a folder of names open in front of her, names she had signed off on without reading each file as closely as she probably should have. She told herself this was normal. New leadership made difficult decisions. That was supposed to be the job description, whether she liked the weight of it or not. She left the office long after nearly everyone else had gone home, having spent the evening buried in budget reviews that bled into one another without any clear end. The rain had started an hour earlier, and by the time she reached the county road outside Roanoke, It was falling hard enough that her wipers barely kept pace with the windshield. The dashboard lights flickered once, dimmed, then died entirely along with the engine. She coasted onto the narrow shoulder, hazards blinking weakly against the dark, and reached for her phone out of habit. It was dead. She had forgotten to charge it since sometime around noon, buried under 3 consecutive meetings. Headlights approached slowly from behind, careful in the downpour, and Daniel Cole's truck rolled to a stop along the shoulder behind her. For a moment he sat there with the engine idling, studying the car in front of him through streaked glass. He knew that car. He knew the woman behind the wheel, because her photograph had hung in the lobby of the very building he had walked out of that same morning, printed beneath the words, "New Leadership, a New Chapter." Something tightened briefly in his chest, a flicker of old anger surfacing before he could stop it. Then he shut it down. The job was one thing, already finished, already behind him. This was a person stranded alone in the rain at midnight, and there was no version of the man he wanted to be that could simply drive past that and keep going. He stepped out into the storm, jacket pulled up over his head, and tapped 2 knuckles gently against her window. She rolled it down an inch, wary, mascara already running down her cheeks from frustration more than anything resembling fear. He held both hands up, empty, harmless, and asked if the battery had died on her. She nodded, too exhausted to argue or explain, and watched him walk back through the rain to his own truck for a set of jumper cables without ever asking his name. Under the raised hood, water running steadily down the back of his collar, Daniel worked with the calm precision of a man who had handled far more complicated repairs than a dead car battery on the side of a rural road. He traced a corroded connection near the terminal, cleaned it with the edge of his sleeve, and reattached the cables with hands that did not shake despite the cold soaking through his jacket. Catherine watched from the driver's seat, door cracked open despite the weather, curious about him in a way she could not fully explain to herself. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked, when the engine finally caught and turned over on the second attempt, headlights flooding back to life. "Navy," he said, just that single word, offered without elaboration. He did not explain the years spent designing logistics systems for forward operating bases overseas, did not mention the 2 patents that still carried his name on federal filings somewhere in a government office. He did not mention that the steadiness in his hands came from an entire life most people never saw behind the quiet, unremarkable exterior of a warehouse supervisor. He straightened up slowly, wiped his hands on a rag pulled from behind his seat, and told her plainly that the battery would need a full overnight charge before she trusted it on any longer drive. She thanked him, still shivering under a thin coat that had done nothing against the rain, still entirely unaware that the man standing in front of her had been unemployed by her own signature roughly 10 hours earlier. For the first time all day, she felt something other than exhaustion settle over her. A stranger had stopped in the middle of a storm and asked for nothing at all in return. It was such a small thing on its surface. It felt, somehow, enormous. He offered to follow her to the nearest gas station, so she would not risk being stranded a second time before morning. She agreed gratefully, and pulled back onto the road behind his taillights, thinking quietly about how rare it was these days to meet someone who helped without calculating, even for a second, what they might get out of it later. In her experience, kindness usually came with a price tag attached somewhere, a favor owed, a name dropped later at the right moment. This felt different, and she could not decide yet whether that made her more relaxed or more suspicious of her own read on people. She checked her mirror twice on the short drive, half expecting his headlights to peel off somewhere, to disappear the way most convenient help eventually did once the inconvenience passed. They did not. He stayed exactly 2 car lengths behind her the entire way, patient, steady, never once crowding her bumper even when the road narrowed and the rain thickened again for a stretch near the bridge. Daniel drove behind her the entire way, silent behind the wheel, the folded letter still sitting in his glove compartment, the weight of whether to say anything about it growing heavier in his chest with every mile that passed beneath his tires. At home much later that night, after Lily was long asleep down the hall, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table, with the termination letter spread open in front of him, under a single dim light. He read it twice, slowly, then folded it back along its original crease and placed it inside a drawer beside old utility bills and a photograph of his late wife smiling somewhere sunlit and long gone. He did not mention any of it to anyone that night. He did not let it change the simple fact that he had stopped his truck for a stranger in the pouring rain, without hesitation, without asking who she was first. That was simply who he had always chosen to be, and he refused to let one difficult morning take that away from him now. The gas station sat beneath a flickering overhead sign, nearly empty, except for a tired attendant behind bulletproof glass and a tow truck driver who arrived roughly 20 minutes later to haul Catherine's car away for a full inspection. She and Daniel waited together inside, under buzzing fluorescent light, 2 paper cups of bitter gas station coffee cooling between them on a sticky plastic table, rain still tapping steadily against the windows. "I'm Kate," she said, holding out a hand still damp and cold from the storm outside. "Daniel Cole," he answered, shaking it firmly. He gave his full name without hesitation, because lying about who he was had simply never occurred to him as an option. Whether she recognized it or not, he told himself, was entirely her business now, not his to manage or control. She did not recognize it at all. She had signed off on dozens upon dozens of personnel decisions that same week alone, names moving through spreadsheets far faster than any single face could reasonably attach itself to memory. Daniel Cole meant nothing to her in that quiet moment. He was simply a kind stranger who had happened to pull over in a storm when almost anyone else would have kept driving. They talked while they waited, the conversation moving easier than either of them expected from 2 people who had met less than an hour earlier. She asked what he did for work, and he told her, honestly enough, that he had just recently left a warehouse position, offering no company name attached to it. It was not a lie, exactly. It simply was not the whole truth yet. Not tonight. Not like this. She talked about her father and about inheriting a company she still felt like she was only pretending to understand. About the particular loneliness that came with decisions nobody else around her seemed willing to make first. He listened more than he spoke, the way he always had, the kind of quiet, attentive listening that made people feel, if only briefly, like the only person left in the room. He mentioned Lily once, briefly, the way a tired father sometimes does without quite meaning to turn the conversation back toward himself. 9 years old, he told her, obsessed lately with baking soda volcanoes, missing her mother more on some days than on others, though she rarely said so out loud anymore. Kate's expression softened in a way that visibly surprised even her. She had not expected to feel anything close to comfort on a night like this. Stranded and soaked and furious with herself, and yet here she was, feeling exactly that beside a stranger in a gas station. When the tow truck finally pulled away with her car strapped tightly behind it, Daniel offered to drive her to the hotel near the interstate where she had been staying while renovations dragged on at her house. She accepted without thinking twice, sliding into the passenger seat of his truck almost automatically. The ride passed in a long, unexpectedly comfortable silence, rain streaking sideways across the windshield, the radio turned down low behind them. Neither of them felt any real need to fill that quiet with unnecessary words. It was the particular kind of silence that only happens between 2 people who are, without quite realizing it yet, beginning to trust each other in some small, private way. He drove home from the hotel that night with the radio off entirely, replaying pieces of the conversation in his head, unable to shake the strange and unfamiliar feeling of having been genuinely listened to by someone who did not know a single thing about the worst parts of his day. It felt almost dishonest, sitting with that feeling. He told himself he would fix it soon, that the truth would come out on his own terms, in his own time, not dragged out by circumstance. The next morning arrived fast and complicated for both of them, in entirely different directions. Daniel made breakfast for Lily, packed her lunch into the same faded backpack, and walked her to the bus stop under a sky still gray and heavy from the night before. Afterward, he sat alone at the kitchen table with his laptop open, sending out 3 job applications before 8:30, each one a quiet reminder of how thin the market had become for a man his age with a narrow, specialized skill set that few local employers seemed to know how to value properly. Across town, Kate walked into an early meeting with Voss and 2 department heads, her mind only half present through most of it. She mentioned, almost in passing, a man who had stopped to help her the night before out on the county road, someone with real technical skill hidden behind an ordinary job, someone who clearly deserved better than whatever position he currently held. Voss shifted slightly in his seat, uncomfortable in a way she did not immediately register, and steered the conversation firmly back toward warehouse output numbers, before she could say anything more about it. Later that afternoon, alone in her office with the door closed, Kate pulled up the restructuring file Voss had prepared weeks earlier and scrolled slowly through names and severance calculations she had approved too quickly the first time around. Something in the totals did not sit entirely right with her. A handful of positions had been eliminated in ways that made little operational sense given the department's actual workload. She flagged 2 names for further review, made a mental note to raise the issue with Voss later that week, then set the file aside entirely when an urgent call came through about quarterly projections. It was not enough yet to raise any real alarm inside her. It was enough to plant a small, persistent doubt that refused to fully go away. She got Daniel's number from the tow company's paperwork later that day, telling herself the small excuse was purely about thanking him properly for the night before. When she called that evening, his voice on the other end sounded surprised at first, then genuinely warm. She invited him to dinner, her treat, nothing more than a simple thank you for a stranger's kindness during a storm. He accepted, turning the phone over slowly in his hand afterward for a long moment, weighing quietly whether he ought to tell her the truth before things went any further than they already had. He decided that he would, eventually. Just not yet, and certainly not over a phone call. She deserved to hear something like that face to face when he was ready to say it properly. The restaurant sat on a quiet downtown corner. Small tables lit by candles that flickered every time the front door swung open to let someone else in from the cold. Kate arrived first, oddly nervous in a way she had not expected to feel, unsure why a simple dinner with a near stranger suddenly felt like it mattered more than it reasonably should have. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, wearing a clean shirt that still smelled faintly of rain from the night they had first met. Conversation came easier than either of them expected once they settled in. She asked about his current job situation, and he told her honestly that he had recently left a position, leaving out the specific details, watching her face closely for any flicker of recognition that simply never came. She told him instead about the pressure of stepping into her father's role too soon, about board members who quietly doubted her judgment at every turn, about a company she was genuinely terrified of running into the ground through her own inexperience. He listened, offering small, careful observations here and there, nothing that gave away how much he actually understood about the very organization she was describing to him in such personal detail. When she mentioned a warehouse efficiency problem the operations team had been struggling with for months, he offered a suggestion so precise, so clearly rooted in first-hand knowledge of the floor layout, that she paused mid-sentence and studied him for a long second. He recovered quickly, waving it off as something he had picked up watching a documentary once, and she let it go, though the moment stayed with her longer than either of them acknowledged out loud. When she reached across the table for the wine bottle to refill both of their glasses, her hand brushed briefly against his resting near the base. Both of them pulled back at almost the exact same moment, neither one saying anything about it out loud. The air between them charged suddenly, with something neither one felt ready to name just yet. Before dinner ended, she asked if he might want to get coffee again sometime. No particular occasion required this time. He said yes, and meant it completely, even as the weight of what he still had not told her pressed harder against his chest with every easy, unguarded laugh she gave him across the small table. That night, driving home alone through empty streets, Daniel passed the exit for Whitfield Industries and slowed without quite meaning to, staring up at the lit company sign above the building for a long moment before finally continuing on toward home. He knew exactly what he had to do next. He just needed to find the right moment to do it properly, without turning something good into a wreckage of misunderstanding, before it had even truly begun between them. Across town that same night, Voss met a supplier in the back corner booth of a nearly empty diner, sliding a thick envelope of cash across the table with the kind of practiced ease that came from doing it more than once before. Numbers on a shipping contract had been quietly inflated for months, the difference disappearing steadily into private accounts. Nobody at Whitfield Industries had ever thought to question closely. Voss had used the recent restructuring as convenient cover, trimming away names that might eventually notice the math did not add up, Daniel Cole chief among them, a man sharp enough to catch discrepancies most people around him would simply overlook. Daniel called Kate 2 days later and asked to meet somewhere quiet, his voice steady but noticeably careful, in a way she picked up on immediately over the phone. They met at a small park near the river. The kind of place with nothing but benches and a long walking trail, nowhere for either of them to easily hide behind polite small talk if things turned serious. He told her plainly, without softening any of it. His full name was Daniel Cole. He had worked in the Whitfield Industries warehouse for 6 years straight, She had personally signed his termination letter the very same morning she later got stranded on the county road outside town. He watched her expression shift slowly from confusion to disbelief to something closer to genuine shame, and he did not look away from any part of it, even as it clearly hurt her to hear. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice tight with something between hurt and embarrassment. "Because that night, you didn't need to know who I was," he said quietly. "You needed someone to stop the car. Everything that happened after that just happened the way it happened. One thing leading honestly into the next." Before she could fully respond to that, Tom Bradley approached from a nearby bench where he had been waiting patiently, a thick manila folder held tightly in one hand. He had reached out to Daniel 2 days earlier, after overhearing troubling whispers in HR about irregularities tied directly to the recent restructuring. Unable to stay quiet any longer, despite the real risk it posed to his own position so close to retirement, he handed the folder over to Kate without any ceremony at all. Inside were printed internal emails, dates and timestamps lining up with uncomfortable precision. Voss had specifically flagged Daniel's name for termination weeks before the official restructuring had even been announced company-wide. Citing a private note about potential contract discrepancies Daniel had quietly questioned during a routine inventory audit months earlier. This had never really been a simple layoff. It had been a targeted removal, deliberately timed to happen before Daniel could ever raise the issue formally through proper channels. Kate read through the pages twice, her hands tightening steadily around the folder's worn edges as the picture became clearer with every line. The warehouse cuts she had approved without reading closely enough. The numbers that had never quite sat right in that restructuring file, all of it began forming a shape she did not want to see, but could no longer reasonably ignore or explain away. She thought back to the meeting where Voss had first proposed the restructuring list, how confidently he had walked her through it, how she had trusted his years of experience over her own hesitant instincts, because she was still new and still afraid of looking foolish in front of people who had run the company far longer than she had. She felt sick, thinking about how easily she had signed it, not because signing termination letters was new to her, but because she had let someone else's confidence replace her own judgment on something that mattered this much to a real person's life. "I need to make this right," she said quietly, more to herself in that moment than to either man standing across from her in the cold. Tom shifted uncomfortably where he stood, admitting under his breath that he could easily lose his own position for coming forward this way, that his wife's medical coverage depended entirely on him staying employed through at least the end of the year. He explained quietly that he had sat on this information for nearly 2 weeks, unable to decide whether loyalty to a paycheck outweighed loyalty to what was right, until he saw Daniel at the grocery store with Lily one evening, watching the two of them laugh over a cart of groceries, and something in him simply could not stay quiet any longer after that. Kate assured him immediately, without a moment's hesitation, that nothing happening here today would ever cost him his job. Daniel said nothing for a long moment, simply watching her closely, quietly recalculating everything he thought he had already understood about the woman who had once signed his termination letter without looking up. She called an emergency meeting for the following morning, summoning Voss to her office under the simple pretense of a routine budget review he would have no reason to suspect. Daniel came too, standing near the window as Voss walked in, confident and entirely unbothered at first, until his eyes finally landed on the folder sitting open across Kate's desk. Voss denied everything at first, his voice sharp with practiced authority, insisting the numbers had simply been misread, that Tom Bradley had clearly misunderstood standard internal procedure. He turned toward Tom with a thin, faintly threatening smile, reminding him coolly how easily his employment could end that very same afternoon if he pushed this any further. Daniel stepped forward then, calm but unmistakably firm in his tone. He told Voss plainly that he had spent 6 years in that warehouse before any of this happened, 4 years before that in the Navy designing logistics systems most people in this office would never fully understand, that he currently held 2 patents in his own name for supply chain technology still actively used by federal contractors today. He was not a man who could simply be threatened into silence, not by Voss, not by anyone else in that building. Voss laughed, short and dismissive, and asked what any of that had to do with a shipping contract. Daniel answered without raising his voice. "Everything," he said, "because a man who spent years accounting for every bolt and every mile in a war zone tends to notice when the math on a domestic freight contract does not add up. He had noticed it during the inventory audit months earlier, flagged it through the proper channel, and watched his name appear on a termination list 2 weeks later. That was not a coincidence, and everyone standing in the room understood it the moment he said it plainly out loud. Voss's composure finally cracked under the pressure. In his effort to discredit Daniel in front of everyone, he said far too much, admitting specific details about the shipping contract inflation that no innocent explanation could ever reasonably account for, details that matched exactly what already sat documented in Tom's folder. 2 attorneys Kate had quietly asked to wait in the adjoining conference room stepped in at that exact moment, having heard more than enough through the partially open door. Kate suspended Voss on the spot, escorting him out of the building herself, while security quietly collected his access badge and personal items. The office went unusually quiet in his absence afterward, the particular kind of silence that follows something finally breaking apart after being wrong for far too long. 3 days later, Kate stood in front of the full board of directors, laying out everything they had uncovered in careful detail: the falsified contracts, the retaliatory termination, the financial discrepancies stretching back well over a year before her own arrival. Board members pressed her hard throughout, questioning pointedly how something like this had happened under her ladyship so early into her tenure as CEO. She did not make excuses for any of it. She answered every single question directly, taking full responsibility for what she had personally missed, while making absolutely clear who actually bore the deeper blame for what had happened. One older board member, a woman named Eleanor Shaw who had served on the board since before Kate was born, asked pointedly whether the company had any legal exposure from the wrongful termination itself. Kate answered honestly that it likely did, and that she intended to make it right regardless of what the lawyers eventually advised, because the right thing to do and the legally safest thing to do were not always the same decision, and she knew which one she wanted to be known for making. Eleanor studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, something like approval settling into the older woman's expression. The vote to formally remove Voss from the company passed without a single dissenting voice. The entire matter referred immediately to outside legal counsel for further investigation. When the meeting finally closed, Kate asked Daniel to stay behind a moment longer. Several board members still gathered loosely near the doorway on their way out. She apologized to him there, in front of people who genuinely mattered to the company's future direction, not as some private gesture behind closed doors, but as something she deliberately wanted witnessed by everyone present. She told the board plainly that the company had nearly lost a man with real, rare expertise through a decision built entirely on someone else's corruption, and she intended to correct that mistake immediately and publicly. She offered him a new position leading operational engineering, a role built specifically around the very skills that had been dismissed without a second look weeks earlier by people who never bothered to understand them. Daniel considered it for a long moment before finally answering her. "I'll take it," he said evenly, "but not because you owe me anything for what happened. Because I'm right for it, plain and simple." Kate nodded slowly, something like genuine respect passing quietly between them that no simple apology alone could ever have delivered on its own. Later that same week, Daniel stood alone in the hallway outside his new office, staring at a nameplate not yet installed on the door, one hand resting deep in his pocket around an old Navy service pin he still carried with him everywhere he went. 6 years he had walked these same halls almost entirely unseen for what he truly knew and could do. Now his name would sit on a door 2 full floors above where he used to work every single day. He started the new role the following Monday, sitting through meetings filled with engineers who listened to him differently now, aware of the patents attached quietly to his name, aware of exactly why Kate had personally fought to bring him back into the company at all. He adjusted slowly and carefully, making sure never to let the new title change the way he treated the people he had worked alongside in that warehouse for years before any of this happened. On his 3rd day, he walked down to the warehouse floor during his lunch break, still in his new badge, and helped 2 loaders untangle a jammed conveyor line without anyone asking him to. Word of it spread through the building faster than any official announcement about his promotion had. Men who had known him for years nodded at him differently after that, not because his title had changed, but because he clearly had not. Lily visited the office one afternoon after school, backpack still slung over one shoulder, eyes wide at the sheer size of her father's new desk and the tall windows behind it. Kate happened to be passing through that same hallway and stopped to say hello, kneeling down easily to Lily's height, with a warmth that seemed to surprise even her own assistant standing nearby. Lily studied her carefully for a moment, head tilted, then smiled, the kind of unguarded warmth only children ever seem to offer strangers so freely. Daniel watched the two of them from across the room, something quietly settling deep in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. Lily asked, with the blunt curiosity only a 9-year-old could get away with, whether Kate was her dad's boss now. Kate considered the question seriously before answering, telling her that she supposed she was, technically, though it felt more like they were figuring things out together most days. Lily accepted this answer with a satisfied nod, then asked if Kate liked baking soda volcanoes, and Kate admitted she had never actually made one, which Lily declared to be a tragedy that needed correcting as soon as possible. Tom Bradley kept his position through the transition, his wife's medical coverage secured without interruption, quietly grateful every single time he passed Daniel in the hallway now. The warehouse ran differently in the months that followed, decisions made with noticeably more care, numbers checked twice now before anyone ever signed off on them again. Kate and Daniel found themselves in each other's company more often than either of them strictly needed for work-related reasons alone. Late meetings that ran well past 6 o'clock slowly became coffee left waiting quietly on each other's desks the following morning. Small unspoken gestures that neither one ever commented on directly out loud. Something between them kept shifting steadily forward, quiet and entirely unhurried, the particular kind of thing that never needed announcing loudly to anyone in order to feel completely real. One Saturday, Kate showed up unannounced at Daniel's house with a toolbox she barely knew how to use, insisting she wanted to help him replace the fence board Lily had complained about for weeks. She ended up sitting on the back porch steps instead, watching father and daughter argue cheerfully about whether the paint should be blue or green, and found herself laughing harder than she had in months. Daniel caught her watching them, and did not look away first this time. Lily, without any prompting from either adult, asked if Kate wanted to stay for dinner, and neither Daniel nor Kate managed to answer right away, both of them a little too pleased by the question. One evening, months later, rain fell steadily against the office windows in almost the exact same way it had fallen the night they first met out on that dark county road. Kate found Daniel still sitting at his desk, reviewing plans quietly for the next fiscal quarter. Lily fast asleep on the small couch in the corner where she often waited now after school activities ran long into the evening. Kate sat down across from him, watching the rain trace slow lines down the window for a moment before finally speaking. "Do you ever regret stopping that night?" she asked softly, "knowing everything you already knew about me by then." Daniel thought about it for a moment, though he already had his honest answer ready. "If I had to do it all again, knowing everything I know now, I'd stop for you exactly the same way, without changing a single thing," he said. Neither of them said anything else for a long, comfortable moment after that. Her hand rested lightly near his on the surface of the desk between them, and this time neither one pulled away from it. Outside the window, the rain kept falling steadily, unbothered and constant, the very same rain that had once stranded two complete strangers on a dark road who had no possible way of knowing then how much that single night would eventually change everything about both of their lives. Daniel finally rose after a while and crossed the quiet room to gently cover Lily with his jacket, where she slept curled against the armrest, her breathing slow and even in the dim light. Kate watched him from across the office, a quiet smile settling naturally over her face, something she made absolutely no effort at all to hide from him this time. Neither of them had been looking.